Hi, and welcome to our first lecture of week 3. Our topic this week is Owning the Earth, Land, Conflict, and American Property Traditions. Now, before getting really into things today, I want to start with some of your reflections on the main board, the responses to the lectures from weeks 1 and 2. Now, when I teach in person, I try to start out every single class with these, but, because we're doing this asynchronously and because each of you are kind of completing things at different times, it's kind of hard to do. So I'm recording this video on the Friday before you're seeing this. So what I've done is I picked a few responses from the main board that I thought were interesting. I just kind of picked the first few that popped out at me. So if I didn't pick yours, doesn't mean I didn't like your thoughts. But here's some samplings of some ideas I thought were interesting. This was reflecting on the world the founders made. This is specifically reflecting on the issue of gerrymandering, which again, I made the argument was kind of a natural result of some unclarity in the Constitution. Some people have supported the idea, stating that it's good practice to set federal law to ban gerrymandering in the US. Still, such a law might run into conflict with states' rights that permit different states to have different voting laws. However, it argues that we should have one because kind of protecting, our democratic systems is more important than making some states happy. I thought those were some interesting thoughts. Here's a post reflecting on whether or not the idea of WASPism is still relevant. This person said, yes, it is. WASPism is still a relevant idea in our world today, although it isn't as relevant as it was before, but it still has an impact on American culture. For example, in most families now, responsibilities are shared 50-50 between parents and not like it used to be where the man provides for the house while the woman takes care of it. Actually, I want to keep reading, so this is kind of interesting. I still had an argument about this with my partner, and she wants to have a career and be independent, which is fine, but I personally want a stay-at-home partner. Family roles nowadays is becoming more diverse, and this presents a decline from the traditional values linked to WASPism. Interesting thoughts there. And finally, we have a really, I think, complex and honest reflection on the whole presentism issue, right? Like, if you lived back then, would you support slavery? Sean had this to say. There were times when I was younger when the question was posed to me, if you were alive in the 1700s, would you own slaves? The immediate response is, no, slavery is wrong. I would have known back then. However, if I were born in the 1700s, I think my views would have been different. I was born into a family originally who were poor Irish immigrants, so assuming I was born into the same family, I don't think that my family back then would have even been able to afford slaves, even though we were white. This potentially could have led me to being sympathetic or even anti-slavery. However, there's no real way of knowing that I would have thought. Yeah, again, interesting thoughts dealing with some of those complex issues. And now we have some reflections from week 2. Ashley was reacting as a feminist to the 2 songs, About the Green Berets and The Fuck Cheer. About the Green Berets, I understand your sense of pride in your men and your country, but why is this song only for men? What about the women standing behind these brave men who are supporting them every step of the way? Why don't we get any acknowledgement? Women are just as strong as men, so why are we excluded? Interesting. And then to the second song, the song got a real laugh out of me. And then there's a quote from it. This made me chuckle because as a feminist, we are criticized and not supported by communists. I thought this was some interesting thoughts. So, by the way, I'm recording this like before most of you have watched this lecture. I really wanted to pick someone reacting as a traditionalist, but there wasn't anything on the board from that yet. So, I apologize for that. Here's a thought from Daniel on whether the 1950s still shapes us. And he says, the culture, politics, and ideas of the 1950s still shape us today because the suburbs are still mostly white. I myself am currently living in a suburb, and most of the people I see are white. I don't see much POCs in my neighborhood, but there are a few. If you go to the city, it is mostly people of color who live there, from what I've seen. So I think that part of housing in the 1950s still lingers a bit today. By the way, our second lecture for this week is going to deal with the question of kind of the city and the suburbs and how that tension arose. So we're going to be dealing with this. We're going to be exploring this more in depth shortly. And finally, from Joelle, answering the question, to what extent does the legacy of slavery continue to shape race relations and issues in America? The legacy of slavery shapes today's race relations, issues, etc. entirely. I think outside of policy like redlining, gentrification, segregation, and so on, slavery shapes the foundations of how people see and interact with the world. Slavery has profound implications for what is deemed knowledge and how people are allowed to be. I also think an undermentioned legacy of slavery and its co-constitutive anti-Black racism is how it shaped American Western science and biological sex and gender, just how we understand bodies in general. So again, this is something a lot of people disagree with. Maybe you disagree with what she just said, maybe you didn't, but again, it's okay. And all of these are examples of the kind of reflections and thoughts I hope you're developing as you watch the lectures. Okay, so let's now get back to property, and we're going to start with our big idea for the week. And the first part of this is early Americans broke with centuries of British tradition to develop new ideas about property, creating unparalleled wealth and opportunity, right? So America developed some property traditions that in some ways were based on what the British did, but in other ways were radical breaks from it, and radical breaks that we're still kind of experiencing the kind of historical echoes of that today. However, property ideas must be placed within the larger context of settler colonialism and manifest destiny. About it is property creates winners and losers. And that has been the case all throughout history. And that's going to kind of what we're going to be seeing through a series of case studies today. So here's our agenda. We're going to start with private property and the American dream. I always like to start with a little contemporary case study to kind of get you hooked. And then we're going to go way back to the roots of some of our property traditions in the doctrine of discovery and settler colonialism. And then we're going to get more specific to the kind of early American era and kind of compare and contrast, okay, what were British ideas about property and how did early American traditions both kind of build on those, but really radically break from them? And then we're going to look at a significant era in history that I'm sure most of you have learned about already. And hopefully what I'm going to teach you will not be terribly redundant, because I think the Manifest Destiny era really solidified America's property ideas. So I think it's important to spend some time with that. So one last order of business. I want to ask a question, what is property? You're like, well, that's a really dumb idea. I know what property is. When we say property today, we tend to think of like land. However, from a kind of legal standpoint, property is an extraordinarily expansive concept in America today. So before kind of looking at where our property traditions came from, I think it makes sense to just define the word property according to kind of current understandings of the term. So today, property is a bundle of ownership rights to civet property. What? Let me break that down. Basically, it's an acronym kind of spelling out what you can and can't do with property. So C is control, right? If you own something, you can control it. If you own something, you can claim value of assets from it, right? You can buy it, you can sell it or trade it or whatever. If you own something, you can exclude others from it, right? So, real estate's a great example of that. If somebody walks across your lawn, technically they are trespassing and you can respond accordingly depending on what state you live in. And then lastly, you can transfer property, right? So that's when we say civet, that's what we mean. And again, the concept of property is expansive and ever expanding as our world becomes increasingly complex, particularly in the digital space. Concepts of property are kind of ever expanding. So today, property can include so many things. For example, trademarks, the Nike swoosh, right? You can't put a swoosh on your shoe and sell it without getting sued. Media text, broadcasts, YouTube videos, etc. Certain types of genetically modified material that are owned by like corporations or patent holders or whatever are considered property. Creative works, right? Music, films, etc. And of course, real estate. In the context of this lecture, property is a much more expansive concept. So in contemporary American vernacular, kind of everyday language, property and land are often used interchangeably. However, for the sake of today's lecture, I'll be using property in the sense of the slide we just saw, in the sense of a bundle of ownership rights. And we'll try to use the terms land or real estate when I'm talking about physical property that one can build on and develop. I'm going to try to do that. I might slip up here and there. But again, when I say property, I don't mean just land. I mean property in the expansive sense. So let's start with private property and the American dream. I'll tell you something that everybody knows, but there's this thing called the American dream, right? The American dream, different people have different versions of it, but the short version is America is a place where anyone can make it. All you need to do is work hard and you will succeed and progress and achieve upward mobility, right? And a key part of the American dream is home ownership, right? So me personally, I can even speak to this as a good, middle-class kid who grew up in the suburbs. The idea that you eventually want to own a home as an investment, as equity, as kind of generational wealth you can pass on to your kids, right? That was a lesson that was really drilled in to me at a pretty young age. However, homeownership, or maybe the expectation that homeownership is something that Americans have, also creates a lot of anxiety, a lot of reasons, one of which being that the barriers to homeownership are higher now than they were a few generations ago. Here's a little video to kind of illustrate that.
Owning a home, it is the American dream. Try telling that to millennials. Palm Beach County's fierce housing market has made it virtually impossible for this group to not only find a home, but buy a home. And that's why areas like right behind me here in Port St. Lucie, in Tradition, in St. Lucie County, they are booming with pre-construction right now, booming with development. We're live right now off Southwest Village Parkway and Becker Road in Port St. Lucie. Chopper 5 giving you a bird's eye view of all the growth in this area, all the pre-construction and development that's taking place. All these younger families are migrating north to this area along the Treasure Coast for one thing: more affordable housing. In tonight's Priced Out of Paradise report, I caught up with a local couple, a young couple, newly married. They live in Royal Palm Beach. They live with her parents, and they're watching their dream of owning a home vanish day by day. Take one glance down the skyline in West Palm Beach. Palm trees, beaches, and a hot real estate market dot the landscape. Palm Beach County virtually sells itself and has quickly caught the attention of buyers around the country.
It is scary. It is really scary when we look at these prices.
Rebecca Lucatero and her husband Eric, both in their mid-20s, saw their dream of owning a home and went after it.
The closer you get to where everyone is at, the higher it is.
Then came reality. Home after home, offer after offer.
It's just infuriating because I don't know how we're supposed to move on and create up the life that we want with the circumstances that are currently going on.
So as that video said, homeownership is really important to a lot of Americans, and there are a lot of Americans who are really anxious about the possibility of owning a home. And here's just some recent data to kind of like further illustrate that anxiety, right? Homeownership rates in general, if you look at the past few decades, they kind of hover in the mid to high 60s. However, you can see those rates tend to go up and down, right? We can see throughout the 90s and early 2000s, things were going up and up and up and up. This was the financial crisis of 2008, which we're going to deal with in our last lecture, but things went down and down and down for a long time since. The overall trajectory has been upward. Here's our little COVID dip, right? The people getting, the number of people getting evicted really went up. Unfortunately, a lot of people lost their homes, but the numbers have been going steadily up. It's kind of good and bad. Things go up and things go down, but still a majority of Americans tend to own their homes. About how owning your own real estate in America is such a big deal. Maybe another question is, well, how do we stack compared to other countries? There's a lot of information and data on this chart, but the thing I want to zero in on is down here. America's home ownership rates are actually below the international average compared to these other countries whose economies are similar to ours. Maybe that's fueling some of the anxiety as well, that maybe we don't stack up compared to places like Bulgaria or Singapore in terms of home ownership rates. Now, how has this affected your generation? Well, I probably don't need to answer that question to you. If you're a Gen Z person, you're sitting there, you're probably thinking about your opinion and attitude towards home ownership rates, and maybe there's some anxiety there. And I think this chart both captures that anxiety, but also some hope. We haven't been tracking Gen Z homeownership data for very long, but it seems like Gen Z so far is doing pretty well. However, as this headline, I think, really captures, it's a boomers housing market. So again, the boomers were the group that we kind of looked at in one of our lectures last week. The generation of Americans that was kind of born in the 50s and 60s, and in a lot of ways created the economy that we're still living in and fighting over. So, there's some things to be happy about, some things to not be happy about. But regardless of your personal opinion on whether you want to own real estate property or not, it's a good kind of entrance into this topic, right? That property, owning things is something that a lot of Americans feel very, 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 very strongly about. And today, we're going to be looking at some of the roots and history of America's property traditions. And in order to really find where the roots are, we have to go way back, centuries back, before we Europeans even started colonizing this hemisphere. And we're going to look at something known as the doctrine of discovery and settler colonialism. Now, before kind of defining and explaining what the doctrine of discovery was, we need to start here. When we talk about religion in a few weeks, we'll get more in depth on this topic. But for about 1,000 years, Western Europe was basically ruled by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church owned most of the land. The Catholic Church was deeply involved in the economics and the politics and the culture and the religion. The Catholic Church was the center of Western European society, and it was pretty much the only option out there. It wasn't like today where you can just go to some other church if you don't like the church you're at, right? Western Catholicism was ruled by someone called the Pope. And if the Pope made a proclamation, that proclamation was basically like law in a lot of ways. And sometimes popes would release things called papal bulls. So papal is an adjective meaning related to the pope or from the pope, and a bull is basically like an official pronouncement. And as various explorers and adventurers from Western Europe started discovering new lands, like Christopher Columbus, etc., various popes started proclaiming various policies, giving broad directives about how colonization and exploration could take place. A series of papal bulls that have kind of been lumped into this larger category of the doctrine of discovery. So let's define it, and then I'm going to play a video that will explain this a little more in depth. So in 1493, the Catholic Pope announced a policy stating that all foreign, quote unquote, barbarian lands could and should be claimed for European Christianity, right? So right off the bat, as explorers are finding these new lands, which eventually, some of which would become the United States of America, the most powerful institution in Western Europe basically said, this is okay. Not only is it okay, but we should be doing this, right? We should be advancing Christ's kingdom all over the earth. And part of that is basically taking over these lands that are, inhabited by these barbarians, which was a very kind of catch-all term for like kind of godless savages. The doctrine of discovery set the stage for centuries of European colonialism. I'll pause here and let you watch a video kind of further explaining this.
Domination. The language of the papal bulls.
The theme of domination is found in various Vatican documents from the 15th century. For example, in the papal bull of May 4th of 1493, Pope Alexander VI says that it is pleasing to the divine majesty that barbarous nations be subjugated. The Latin word is deprimantur, which means to reduce, to cast down or press down, to hold down. And it also states that it is pleasing to the divine majesty for the Christian empire to be propagated. Pope Alexander VI stated, "We trust in him, from whom empires and dominations and all good things proceed." The Holy See of the Catholic Church issued many such documents even before 1493. For example, in 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued a directive to King Alfonso of Portugal to go to the western coast of Africa and to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to take away all their possessions and property. That directive was reissued in 1455, 1456, 1481, 1493, 1506, and 1514. So why was the document called a bull? It had to do with the fact that the document was sealed with wax, and that wax was imprinted with the papal ring and the insignia of the Holy See. From that wax was hung a red silken thread, and at the end of the red thread was a lead ball, and the Latin word for ball is bulla. What these documents demonstrate, though, in terms of the language that was used, is the pattern or the paradigm of domination and dehumanization. And this is very clear by looking closely at the kind of language that was used in those documents. They go back to a root word, domo, in Latin, which is a very unusual and obscure word. And it has 7 main meanings: to subjugate, to subdue, to force into subservience, to tame, to domesticate, to cultivate, and to till. To cultivate in Latin is colere, which means to colonize or design. When you take the root of colonize, you have colon, which is the digestive tract of the body politic that is coming in invasively into the lands and territories of indigenous nations and peoples. And that colonizing, digesting activity makes that predator body politic a devouring, consuming body that's coming in invasively on top of the original nations and peoples.
So long story short, late medieval Catholicism was in the empire building business. Terms that arose to kind of describe this is the term Christendom, right? So it's kind of like combining the words like Christ and kingdom. The idea was, we have the only correct religion in the world. We are the most powerful entity on the globe right now. And our power and our military might and our economic might kind of prove that God is on our side. And therefore, we have the right and even the duty to go and conquer these foreign lands and bring them, kind of like under the lordship of Christ, right? We are God's or Christ's emissaries on earth. Christ is king, and therefore we are kind of exercising Christ's kingdom or Christ's rule on these savages and barbarians who, worship false gods. And what we're doing is not only okay, it is absolutely the right thing to do. Now, fast forward a century or so, and England had also gotten to the empire building business and was going all around the world and kind of conquering lands for British rule. A little side note, by this point, England was no longer Catholic. It was overwhelmingly Protestant, which is something we're going to talk about more in a future class. But the Brits carried a lot of these ideas from Catholicism, in particular the doctrine of discovery, even if they didn't call it that. But this attitude, this kind of mindset, like we are superior and it's okay if we conquer because that is what God has called us to do, right? That mindset followed from Catholicism to Protestantism, and the British, along with, France and Spain, and to a lesser extent Portugal, started kind of colonizing the world. And of course, the British primarily colonized the eastern seaboard of what would eventually become the United States and kind of made up, as we talked about before, the cultural base of what is today the United States of America. Of course, there's a word for this. That word is imperialism. Probably a word most of you know, but I think it makes sense to define it here. So what were the Brits doing? Well, they were doing this. They were engaging in imperialism, which is a form of empire building where a nation extends its reach into less powerful territories for political and or economic gain. So here's like a 19th century political cartoon kind of showing that. And then here's a map from 1290 showing the Mongol Empire. What's the point of this image? Well, humans have been in the empire building business since forever. The Brits did not invent it. The Spanish did not invent it in the age of discovery. Going back as far as 2,000 years before the birth of Christ, we have evidence of, ancient peoples like the Akkadians taking over other territories. So this, for whatever ugly, weird reason, this is like a deep human drive. Sometimes when people get power, they want to extend that power into other people's geographic regions. So this was nothing new. However, the particular type of colonialism that the British people were practicing was really significant and would have far-reaching consequences. So specifically, the type of colonialism the British were practicing was something known as settler colonialism, right? It's a type of imperialism in which indigenous populations are replaced with people from the colonizing nation. So here we have some images showing that, right? We have a kind of a painting of an early colonial settlement. I believe this is supposed to be representing Jamestown, which, again, was the first kind of successful British settlement in the New World. And here we have a historical artifact from, a few decades later, the Manifest Destiny area, which we're going to look at later today. And here we have evidence of, Americans basically just taking Indian land and selling it. So colonization didn't just end after the United States became a nation. Replacement happens through removal, genocide, and or assimilation. So as we're going to explore a little more the story of the Native Americans, there was a bit of all of these. Now, a little side note, you might be asking, well, are there other kinds of colonialism? Isn't this the only kind? Well, no, the other major kind is known as economic colonialism. So think about what the British did in India, or think of what England and France did in terms of colonizing certain African countries in the early 20th century. Colonization is where basically you take over the economy and the politics of a nation, thousands and tens of thousands of your citizens into those countries to kind of take it over physically, right? So the difference is, are you trying to replace that population or are you just trying to control the population? So that's kind of the big picture. The doctrine of discovery and the tradition of settler colonialism practiced by the British would be profoundly influential and consequential as kind of attitudes like, this is our land, I don't care if it's yours, it's mine now, right? That I know you lived here, but we live here now, so too bad, right? Those kind of deeply embedded cultural attitudes would have significant and profound effects on the laws and legal traditions in the era, kind of the decades leading up to the revolution and after the United States becomes a country. We're going to kind of spend a little bit of time seeing how those things played out. So to understand some of the roots of our private ideas, we need to start with something called common law. Common law was a major legal system in place in England during the colonial era. And of course, when the colonists came over here, they brought it with them, right? So common law was a loose collection of British court decisions, which became binding legal precedents. So imagine you're in medieval England, there are courts all around the country, judges and, lawyers arguing things in front of judges and stuff like that, just like we have today. In the British tradition, when a judge made a decision, that was supposed to be kind of precedent for other judges to follow. Now, there's no mass communication, so how do you know all this? Well, there were people, scholars and whatnot, who collected these decisions and would publish them in books, and then other judges would have access to those decisions. They were expected to follow precedents. Our legal system has vestiges of this, right? When a judge, a federal judge or a Supreme Court justice or whatever makes a decision, ideally, they're supposed to follow the example set by previous precedents. And this is kind of like a mixture of like an oral law and a written law, right? Even though the decisions were written down, these were decisions that were being kind of made orally in court that people would then write down and disseminate. So common law did shape the founders, as we're going to see. However, early Americans broke from common law by embracing a civil or a written law, which updated many key British traditions. So, the founders of this country saying we're going to be ruled by this written document, not by these kind of like oral court case traditions with how British people did things in the past. So in order to understand how Americans broke from British common law traditions, we need to look at some of the aspects of property in British common law. So here is a kind of short list of how property operated under British common law. What we're going to see is that the rich and powerful had property and basically nobody else did. The royals owned all of the land. Tenants of the land had rights to use but never owned common lands, right? So this idea of just you going out and buying property. What? No, you can't do that. The royals own all that. You can't have private property. Clergy, so the people who worked for the Anglican Church, which is the official Church of England, clergy held tithe rights. 10% of annual farm produce in a parish was their property. So let me explain what that means. If you don't know what a parish is, think of kind of like a public school district, right? If you live in this district, you go to these public schools. In the Church of England, local churches were kind of assigned to different parishes, or I guess vice versa, right? So wherever you lived, there was a church, you were part of a parish, you went to that church, you didn't again, go around to other churches, right? Because that's not how it worked. You were assigned a church, you were assigned a priest, and that was it. And if you were a farmer, as most people were back then, 10% of your farm produce did not belong to you, was not yours to do with what you wished. 10% of your farm produce was a tithe. It went to your local church. Also, titles of nobility, king, queen, prince, duke, earl, etc., right? These were property. These were things that you owned, that you were inherited, and they came with certain rights that were attached to that title. This next one blows people's minds. Labor was owned by the person being labored for. So a lot of you watch this video probably have a job, maybe a full-time job, maybe a part-time job. If you don't like that job, you can just stop showing up, right? That was not the case under English common law. If you worked for someone, your labor belonged to them, right? They could kind of dictate what you did with your labor. This strikes a lot of modern folks as kind of ridiculous and brutal, and maybe even oppressive. However, there were some interesting kind of checks and balances. For example, rural lands held by the wealthy came with common rights for the common people, I should say. Everyday people could fish, graze cattle, and cut timber without permission. Royals own everything, but everyday common people have rights to take resources from those lands without permission. However, even before British colonists started coming to the eastern seaboard of North America, there was a series of kind of modernizing movements in England, kind of put together, known as the enclosure movement. So starting in the mid-1600s, England experienced several enclosure movements, which were social movements in which the wealthy class broke up commonly used parcels of land into individually owned farm plots. So that's what we see here, right? So here are kind of common farmlands, and modernity is kind of really getting off the ground, right? And people are starting to question some of these ideas, and some wealthy people started saying, I don't care what tradition is, I want to move to a more private property system, and they just started breaking up farmlands and selling or renting out those farm plots to people instead of just letting people farm wherever they wanted to. The British colonists brought these evolving property concepts with them. So while the colonies still belonged, quote unquote, to the British Crown, large tracts of undeveloped land fueled immigration and helped set up the conflicts that led to the revolution. So basically, you put all the pieces together, things were going to change, right? You have evolving ideas already in England. Those evolving ideas are coming with them. And we have all of this land that nobody really owns, at least in the minds of the colonists. So let's get a broad overview of those changes. In 1775, right, so the year before the American Revolution, British property concepts remained largely intact. Again, they had already been kind of dissolving and falling apart and being challenged. But we're still a British colony, so English common law is still ruling us, right? Jump forward a few decades, revolution, constitution, statehood, all that stuff happens. By 1830, these British common law ideas have been largely replaced by American ideas. So what specifically did that look like, and how? Well, first point, the split from the monarchy and the Church of England made royal titles, royal land ownership, and mandated church ties irrelevant, right? So we're no longer British, we're now American, we're now a new country. Well, all of these traditions around the monarchy and the Church of England, they're completely irrelevant now, so who cares? Also at this time, this is kind of a refresher of things we talked about in the first week. Americans had, increasingly were embracing Enlightenment arguments. And in particular, Enlightenment thinkers had been arguing that property was a natural right, quote unquote, which government should protect. Again, I put natural right in quotation marks because this is a social construction. This is a viewpoint. This is not like an actual fact that you can prove in a lab under a scientific study, right? But it was an idea that just absolutely galvanized people, particularly as there's all of this land out there that quote unquote nobody owned. Here's a quote from John Locke to kind of demonstrate that. Every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Let me pause there. Again, under British common law, a worker did not own their work, right? A laborer did not own their labor. Guys like John Locke were saying, well, that is stupid. That doesn't seem rational. The great and chief, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths, in other words, the reason why people form governments, and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property, right? So again, this is property in the expansive sense, not just land. But in context, there was tons of land, so land was on everybody's mind. As to our final point on the slide, abundant land led to the invention of quote unquote private land, establishing an American tradition of owning the earth. Virtually no human societies before the United States had embraced the idea of private land ownership quite to the degree that the early United States would. There was some kind of experiments with private land ownership in like the Greco-Roman era. Obviously, as we talked about in the British context, some wealthy people who owned a lot of land were starting to break up their land and sell it. But the idea of privately owning a chunk of the earth and building stuff on it became a very, very, very powerful concept that really shaped the early United States. However, as we all know, the land was not just free, it was not empty, it was not devoid of humans. And the property traditions that early Americans and later US citizens obviously create incredible conflicts, cultural, philosophical, military conflicts. So let's kind of transition a little bit and say, what were some of the property traditions of the original inhabitants of this country? Here's a little video about that.
So the notion of land ownership is from our perspective, a Eurocentric perspective. When the European colonists came here, that was their interpretation and their ideology. It was not our ideology. We did not have a land ownership system. We did have boundaries that delineated, in essence, what is Narragansett territory and what is Wampanoag territory versus what is, Mohegan territory, for examples. But it wasn't what European people thought about land and land ownership. Indigenous people didn't necessarily think that you could own the land. You utilized the land that the Creator gave to you to use and to care for your people on, but you didn't possess the land. There's a different way of thinking about this. So Indigenous people, when they first had contact with European people about the notion of buying land. So, for example, if Roger Williams wanted to put a house up, he'd ask them, can I have a piece of land and I can build my house? Well, of course you can. We have homes, you can have a home, go ahead. But there's even historical quote, I can't remember which sachem is saying it, but the quote is, loosely states that they didn't know that when they gave you this land to utilize, that meant you put a fence around it and that they could no longer traverse across it or no longer hunt the game that was upon it. So there was this notion, this ideological clash, if you will, of Western European ways of thinking and indigenous ways of being that were completely opposite of each other. And so that was a very difficult concept to fathom.
So just to kind of summarize and get something down in your notes, for the diverse nations indigenous to North America, in other words, Native Americans, land was collectively occupied and used according to tribal traditions and boundaries, but ownership didn't exist, right? So maybe there was this concept that okay, my tribe has this territory, your tribe has that territory, and that's fine. But the idea that the tribes owned their land, owned their territory, that was not a thing. That did not exist. And very early on in the history of the United States, that culture clash was basically set up with something known as the Louisiana Purchase. So basically, 1803, President Thomas Jefferson oversees the Louisiana Purchase with France. in which we basically purchased this chunk of land that was French territory. It doubled the size of the nation. This created a thirst for westward expansion and fueled a frenzy for private property ownership, right? So kind of put all the pieces together, right? We have all this land that which people were living there, but again, in the minds of Americans, it's like, okay, well, those people, we can just get rid of them. That's our land. And then you basically double the size of the United States and you have even more land. And this thirst for property ownership, in particular real estate, was just further fueled and inevitably led to a series of conflicts that lasted about 100 years or so.
Today, our map of America looks like this, but around 200 years ago, it looked more like this. How did this map change? To answer this question, first we have to look at the city of New Orleans, one of America's most culturally and historically rich destinations, according to their website. But New Orleans wasn't always part of the United States. Back in 1803, it was located in the southeastern corner of the Louisiana Territory, which was owned by France, and then later given to Spain, and then secretly given back to France in exchange for some land in Italy, and then officially given back to France 2 years later. New Orleans was an important city because it was a good trading location at the end of the Mississippi River. So the US wanted New Orleans, and newly elected President Thomas Jefferson sends 2 guys to negotiate with the French about purchasing the city. Jefferson's original instructions to the 2 men were to attempt to negotiate $10 million to buy either New Orleans, part of the Florida Territory, or at the very least secure access to the Mississippi River port. Now look at this from the French's perspective. Their plans to establish an empire in the Americas was failing. They feared a war with Britain was imminent and that their territory would likely be taken by Canada. So they offered the US a deal too good to refuse. They offered not only New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana Territory, and only bumping up the price from $10 million to $15 million. Now, President Jefferson wasn't totally sure about this purchase. He believed that the government should only do what the Constitution said, and there was nothing in the Constitution about buying land from other countries. But the Senate ratified it, and Jefferson allowed it, and thus the United States purchased the Louisiana Territory and doubled the size of the country, gaining 827,000 square miles for a bargain price. This was a turning point in American history for several reasons. It was the start of Manifest Destiny, which was the Americans' belief that it was their right to expand and settle coast to coast across North America. This also led to the Homestead Act, which allowed people to purchase land in the new territories at very low prices. It started at $1 per acre with a minimum of 640 acres, and later was changed to $125 per acre with a minimum of 320 acres. Lots of Americans began moving to the new land, so many in fact that the people began to pressure the government to open up Oklahoma Territory, which was previously closed to settlement. The day it opened, thousands of people lined up along the border waiting, and at noon, the territory was opened and people rushed to claim land.
Final section of the first half of the lecture, we're looking at Manifest Destiny and quote unquote the Indian problem. Again, Indian problem is not my language. It's in quotes because that was the word that was used at the time to describe this quote unquote problem that we want this land, but Native Americans are living on them. So we need to solve this problem, and let's see how that played out. I know for a lot of you, this is going to be like review from like middle school or like AP history or whatever, but there was something called Manifest Destiny. It was a mid-19th century movement in which WASPs, again, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, cast themselves as destined by God to spread American virtue capitalism and political dominion westward across the continent. So destiny, this is something that has been ordained by God, and all we need to do is manifest it. All we need to do is make it happen, right? And again, part of what we're going to do in this section is kind of compare and contrast the views of Americans moving westward versus the Native Americans who were already living there. And your talk back kind of primed you for that, right? John O'Sullivan was a journalist who was one of the many influential voices really encouraging Manifest Destiny, and Chief Joseph, influential leader of the Nez Perce tribes, which was one of the tribes that was being displaced by westward expansion. And again, the compare and contrast, right? John O'Sullivan, there's almost this like, almost like religious fervor. Like we are doing this. We are going to do this. This is so great. This is so exciting. This is so wonderful. And then Chief Joseph, you have this incredible sorrow and sadness and loss, right? And I think that really captures the two sides of the coin of westward expansion. So to further explore this, I want to play a little video kind of capturing and summarizing the view from kind of an indigenous perspective. What was the dominant viewpoint perspective amongst Native American tribes who were experiencing this displacement?
By the early 19th century, the U.S. was rapidly growing, both in size and power. Land-hungry and ambitious, the new country was also drastically changing its policies towards the Indian nations. And nowhere was this more evident than in the treaties.
The United States' primary interest in treaty making was to acquire Indian land. And so the treaties were used for that purpose, especially as the United States found itself in a position to pretty much dictate the terms of the treaty. And so the treaties morphed from this friendship and reciprocity sort of relationship into a very one-sided thing.
There's almost a mythology about this, that somehow when the Pilgrims arrived, they were dragging land behind them. There was no land brought here. The land here was Native nations. And this is what the United States needed. It's what it wanted. They wanted all of it. They wanted everything.
The greed came in. Well, we have a little tract here now we need a little more. And well, we need to go make another treaty. We didn't understand that eventually those treaty-making processes ended up to the acquisition of all of our ancestral homeland. That land was a part of us. That land helped us be. That land was who we were and who we are.
The command of removal came unexpectedly upon most of us. There was a time that we noticed several overloaded wagons were passing our home, yet we did not grasp the meaning. Then one day, wagons stopped. We were to be taken away and leave our homes, never to return.
To get what they wanted, U.S. officials brokered treaties through any means available. Their tactics were so corrupt that the once trusted treaties became quickly known as bad paper.
There were people at these treaty negotiations who would do anything to get an agreement on the table. And so there was very routinely bribery, individual payments made to tribal leaders. Alcohol would be used to put people in an agreeable frame of mind, and even coercion to say to people, you must sign this agreement or else.
Every means of trickery and fraud was employed against Native nations. The United States would appoint a false leadership, people who had no right to speak for the tribe, and say, you're the leader of this tribe, sign this paper giving away all your land.
As the century progressed, the treaties became more and more lopsided, a far cry from the parallel paths of the Goswenta. Despite appeals from the Indian nations, the U.S. kept on its new trajectory, rationalizing its aggressive actions along the way.
They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement. The tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages. To leave them in possession of their country was to leave the country a wilderness.
It's important in the great American mythology to describe the Americas as wilderness. Because of its wilderness, then there's really nobody to dispossess. It was okay to come here and prosper and conveniently forget that there were already people and civilizations in place.
At first we had something to eat, but that gave out and we were starving. We came to a slippery elm tree and ate the bark of that. Lots took sick and died.
As Americans successfully pushed the bounds of the frontier, they not only believed that they were destined to take over the land and prosper, they believed that God was the one who put them there to do it.
They believed that it was God's will, that the United States should be a continental nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. As each wave of immigration would come, they'd move into an area. The United States would then make some sort of arrangement with the tribe to get that land from them. And then more would come, and they'd advance the frontier even further.
The power of manifest destiny, of expansion, of inevitability, of God's providence helped to rally people around not only the idea of Americans as entitled to North America, but rallied them around the idea that Indian people were barriers to civilization and barriers to progress.
All right, so let's just get some notes down just to generalize how this happened. And again, I know for some of you, this is going to be review, but still, hopefully looking at it from this different angle of like property ownership and the concept of owning land, right? That was really driving this. Hopefully it's, hopefully it's a fresh angle. And again, the Indian problem is a word that a lot of Americans would use to describe this issue. Before the revolution, the British colonial government signed a series of treaties with various American Indian tribes delineating the boundaries of British versus tribal territories. So this was an old tradition that goes back to the colonial era. As more and more colonists were coming, as more and more colonists were, having babies, and the kind of white population on the eastern seaboard is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, Anglo-Americans and Native Americans kept bumping up against each other, in a lot of cases having violent conflicts. So periodically, the British government would enter into treaties saying, okay, this is your land, this is our land. And that was fine for the time, but that wasn't going to last. America kept growing, right? Broken treaties and violent conflicts became commonplace as colonists wanted more land. So yeah, even though there were laws, everyday people were like, well, there's land right there. Why can't I just take it, right? That was the mindset that Americans were developing. There's land there. Nobody owns that. I'm going to take it. And that often created violent conflicts and kind of created this cycle that we're going to see over and over again. After the revolution, federal treaties. So again, the U.S. federal government continued on this tradition of setting up treaties with Native Americans. Federal treaties were drafted as America grew. These were inevitably broken, right? So basically this just kept happening. The government would set standards and say, okay, don't go past this line. Americans would be like, I don't see a line. I'm going to keep going. This is my land now. And this set a cyclical template, in other words, a cycle for all future American Indian interactions. So here is a picture of, I believe this is Ulysses S. Grant, who was the president after the Civil War, brokering some treaties. And it kept cyclically creating broken treaties and conflicts and more treaties and broken treaties and conflicts, right? It just kept going on and on and on and on. And this was really exacerbated in 1830 when Congress passed something called the Indian Removal Act. It tells you exactly in the title of it what it was doing. It authorized the federal government to displace native tribes, annex their land, and move them west of the Mississippi. However, once we got west of the Mississippi, we kept getting more territory and kept going. And eventually America had pretty much displaced all Native American tribes from their original ancestral lands. And in a lot of cases, today, moved them onto Native American reservations. Here's a screenshot of the Indian Removal Act. And I think it's very telling to just read what it says. To provide for an exchange of lands with the Indians residing in any of the states or territories and for their removal west of the river Mississippi. Kind of like inherent dishonesty in this language. To provide for an exchange of lands, right? Exchange sounds great, right? You give me something, I give you something. But that was clearly not what was happening. And if you keep reading, the bill is very clear about that, for their removal, right? So yes, in one sense, in the minds of Americans, like this is a fair exchange, right? But again, in the minds of Native Americans, this was removal. So this bill, even the language of the bill was reflecting this really like tragic tension. The Indian Removal Act led directly to something known as the Trail of Tears. So between 1830 and 1850, about 60,000 Indians were forced to traverse thousands of miles, sometimes on foot, from their ancestral lands to territories west of the Mississippi River. About 3,000 people died during this trek, so it was awful. And they're often kind of escorted by, American soldiers on horseback. Many of these tribes would again be displaced decades later and sent to reservations. People living today who identify as Native American are living on Native American reservations, which are, they're essentially kind of like internal colonies in the United States. So here's a map from the U.S. Geological Survey of current Native American reservations. As you can see, there are virtually none on the East Coast, right? There are none in Maryland, none in Virginia, none in the states surrounding us. There are a few here and there, but the vast majority of them are in the Southwest and Midwest and I guess the Pacific Northwest, excuse me. Okay, last point before I summarize and then pause and have you post something in response. This is a painting that was finished in 1872 by a guy named John Gass, who's, not like a super famous American artist, but this painting is I think, really, really, really an important historical artifact. It's titled American Progress, and I wanted to do a little bit of just kind of like visual analysis and how this painting really, really, really captures the dominant view that the vast, vast, vast majority of white Americans, liberal, conservative in the middle, had towards westward expansion. So first of all, I always ask my students, who is this? And nobody can ever tell me. This is Columbia. So Columbia was the kind of, so there's Uncle Sam. Everybody knows Uncle Sam, right? Columbia is like the female counterpart to Uncle Sam. Columbia is like a mascot for the United States that didn't really make it. We don't really talk about her anymore. It's one of the reasons why Washington, D.C. is called the District of Columbia. The point is, Columbia in this image is like a symbol of the United States. Columbia is moving westward. What is Columbia bringing with her? Well, she's bringing technology, right? She's bringing transportation. She's bringing urbanization. In her hand, probably can't see it, it says school book. And she's also bringing settlers, right? And notice how, it's very kind of, it's almost like impossible to miss, right? Here we have, beautiful sun and light, representing, civilization and truth and progress and things like that. And over here, things are very dark and bleak, and there are Native Americans and there are, buffalo wildlife kind of running away from progress, right? And it just really, this is like the most American painting. And it just really powerfully, and I guess depending on your perspective, you might say kind of like hauntingly or tragically captures the view that white Americans were bringing with them as they're moving further and further west and displacing Native Americans, and meanwhile developing property traditions and connections to owning things, in particular owning land and real estate, that I think still shape us today as we continue to kind of grapple with kind of questions around American identity when it relates to owning land and homes and things like that. So that was kind of a sweeping history of 500 years of property and land concepts. So let me just quickly summarize, right? How did we get here? Well, the doctrine of discovery declares conquest of the Americas blessed by God. And this directly leads to various European powers embracing the doctrine and embarking on an unprecedented project of settler colonialism, in particular the British. After the American Revolution and Constitution and all that stuff, Americans begin to reinvent property rights to center on private ownership of land. Ownership and economic control of land melds with Enlightenment-style individualism to create a burgeoning American identity, right? So it's a very fancy and verbose way of saying, owning land and owning things for yourself in general becomes a really like core American value. This is further solidified and exacerbated and encouraged by policies, right? By the Louisiana Purchase, we have even more land now, and the Indian Removal Act. Oh, we have people who were in that land are now gone. Created this context for westward expansion, and then eventually, this term manifest destiny gets attached to this, right? This idea that God has given this to us and we can take it, and that draws Americans further westward, even more solidifying and propagating the idea of private land ownership. Process some of this. Pick a reflection question and respond. Throughout Western European and American history, Christianity and empire building have been deeply entwined. Reflect on that. Today, the vast majority of Christians in America don't think it's okay to go and take other people's land and territory. However, that has been a core kind of Christian value for a long time. And just, again, open-endedly reflect on that. How does that sit with you? What are the implications of that? Are there vestiges of that today? To what extent does the current culture of land and home ownership descend from this troubling history? A bit, not at all, a lot. So, we kind of ended in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And I kind of just made this general statement that like these values of land ownership are still kind of with us. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Some people would say that things have changed a lot since then. Maybe not. What do you think? Do conflicts over land and land ownership still shape American politics today? Come up with an example. So pick one of these and craft a response. Of course, if you want, you can pick more than one and craft a response. But what do you think about this? Or just in general, if there's something else that I said during this lecture that you really, really, really want to respond to, or something from one of the videos or whatever that these questions don't cover, you can respond to that as well. As long as you say something smart and critical and insightful, I'm happy. For part 2 of this lecture, we're going to be looking at case studies in American property. And to start us out, we're going to do something a little like fun and weird, maybe. More specifically, I want to ask you a question. What time is it? It's quiz time. Not really. This is not a real quiz. I'm going to play you 2 videos and I want you to answer these questions. It's a self-quiz. What do these 2 videos have in common? A correct answer will directly tie into today's theme. I'm going to intentionally be vague. I'm not going to tell you what you're about to see. However, I will say the first video is a trailer for and the second video is a trailer for a video game that recently was released.
Hey there. Thanks for coming out. We've got a bit of an infestation here at the storage facility. We thought it was just rodents, but there's something else in here. There's nests. They're everywhere. We tried to take care of it ourselves, but things have escalated. The exterminators are our last hope. Please, help us before...
Okay, I hope you enjoyed those 2. I just wanted to ask you, what do these 2 videos have in common? So I'm imagining that some of you have no idea and some of you guessed it. Here's an answer to this question. These 2 media texts only exist because the copyrights on the characters recently expired, placing them in the public domain. Specifically, the copyrights on the original Winnie the Pooh character, as created by A.A. Milne, who is a British children's book author, and also, and this is very specific, the Steamboat Willie version of Mickey Mouse. So the earliest iteration of Mickey Mouse is now in the public domain. However, the kind of Disneyfied version of Winnie the Pooh and also the more current iteration of Mickey the Mouse where his eyes look more, cartoony as what we're used to, those are not in the public domain. So because the original Mickey Mouse and the original Winnie the Pooh are in the public domain, we have this probably completely idiotic horror movie. Another Mickey Mouse themed horror movie called Screamboat. They're still developing it. Both of these movies I'll probably see. I'm sure they're both terrible, but I'll probably see them anyway since I lecture on them. I feel like I probably should. And of course, the video game as well, featuring the original Steamboat Mickey Mouse. Why can they do that? Why can Disney not sue them? Well, because they're now in the public domain. And I thought, this was just kind of like a fun and slightly silly or traumatizing if you're a Disney fan. So a little side note that might offend some of you. I despise Mickey Mouse and I really hate Disney. So I think, anything anyone can do to destroy these characters for people, I'm all for it. Your personal views on Mickey Mouse or Disney. We're going to segue now from that into these larger property issues, right? So these videos I just played you, I think, are really, really, really fascinating case studies of the interesting complexity of property issues today. So we're going to start just by making some generalizations about the nature of property in America today. We're going to go into look at 2 case studies a little more in depth. We're going to spend more time with home ownership at the beginning of the first half of the lecture with home ownership, but I know this is an issue a lot of you care about. So I think it's good to maybe spend some time to kind of ask this question, what are some of the unintended consequences of America's culture of home ownership? And then for the last part of this class, we're going to be looking at intellectual property, public domain, and the common interest, and some of the kind of issues around non-tangible property, aka intellectual property. And everything I'm going to be doing for the rest of this lecture is in service to the big idea, which is this: America's property norms often create social power and economic stability for those with access to property. For those without access, this can mean marginalization and economic instability, right? So another way to put this is property creates winners and losers. If you're a winner, great. If you're not a winner, well, it sucks to be you. And we've already seen this a little bit, right? Westward expansion was great for these people, for the mostly white settlers who were able to basically get free or cheap land and develop equity and pass it on to their families for generations and generations. Not so much for the Native Americans who were being displaced. And just to give you another example from a previous week, the American slave system in the antebellum South created incredible wealth and power and even leisure and comfort for a very small number of people. However, it had the opposite effect for the people upon which these property norms, by property, I mean owning enslaved people, right? Enslaved people were property. So again, America's property norms create winners and losers, and that is still the case today. So let's again jump back to our agenda and look at our first item, which is just a brief overview of property today. Just kind of giving you an overall, like a taxonomy, right? So today, property in the United States generally falls into 2 categories. So there are generally 2 types of property in America. One is tangible property, right? That's physical stuff, stuff that you can touch and hold and look at in the physical realm. That includes land and buildings. Material assets, so paper money, cars, clothes, just stuff that you own. Investments, stocks, bonds, etc. Now, this one's a little weird because you're like, well, how is an investment a tangible property? I can't touch an investment. That is the case today, because so much of our money is virtual and digital. But when stocks and bonds were being developed and the stock market was being developed, centuries ago, stocks and bonds were like physical pieces of paper. So for whatever reason, just in terms of the eyes of the law, investments are often still considered tangible property. There's also intangible property, which is non-physical stuff, right? And this obviously, the world of intangible property is ever expanding in our digital world. So that includes intellectual property, right? And if you don't know what I mean by intellectual property, we're going to dig into that more very soon. Digital assets, right? Social media accounts, cryptocurrency, etc., are considered intangible property. Image and reputational capital. What does that mean? Well, if you're a YouTuber or a social media influencer, right? Influence is not something you can touch and hold, but it is certainly a form of property. If you're influential, you can do whatever you want with that influence, just like, the CVET property, right? That's yours. You can do what you want with it. Reputational capital has to do with like a brand, right? Or a corporation. Big brands like, Apple and Microsoft and stuff, people have a certain kind of mental and sometimes even like emotional relationship with those. You can sue somebody for things like libel and slander, right? What are those about? Well, those are basically attacks on your reputation. Slander or libel are basically like lies that directly impact your reputation and in particular affect your ability to, make money and things like that. Of course, both tangible and intangible property can be used to generate wealth and power and generational wealth, right? Which is wealth that is passed down from generation to generation. And one of the reasons why America is such a popular place for so many people from all over the world to come to is because there are so many millions of people across the years and decades and centuries successfully leveraged America's property traditions to make a lot of money and pass it on to their children. To illustrate this, I found a YouTube video online of coach, financial expert, influencer person who put together kind of like a how-to video on how you develop wealth in America. And I'm showing this to you again, not because I want you to develop wealth, but again, I'm showing you this as a kind of cultural artifact that is capturing some of the rhetoric and the very, very, very kind of tried and true American ideas around this issue. Check it out.
How to build generational wealth. Being born with a silver spoon in your mouth is usually used as an insult aimed at members of high society families. People born into wealth seem to have everything given to them since birth. But what many people quickly forget is the sacrifice and hard work that the family's founder went through to create that lifestyle and privileges. These founders toiled and sacrificed to create something that they can pass on to future generations by creating generational wealth. A common theme amongst every parent is that they all dream of creating a life for their children where they would be happy, healthy, and never lack anything. A life where all their needs would be met and fulfilled. This is also what wealth family founders intended for their family and generations to come, to allow their families to have an easier time and to have a better life than the previous generation. What is generational wealth, and how is it different than personal wealth? Generational wealth is a concept where a family passes on a significant amount of assets on to future generations. The family's generational wealth, or more commonly known as the family fortune, is built up years of work and sacrifice. In contrast, there are many millionaires and billionaires around the world that are self-made. This means that they relied upon their hard work to grow their fortunes. When it comes to this group of people, the vast majority of them gain their fortunes through the same hard work and sacrifice that the founders of a family fortune went through. Then there are the lucky few that stumble into their wealth, such as the winners of a national lottery. Though history has proven that many of these lottery winners won't keep their fortunes for long. Like the lottery winners, some millionaires and billionaires will eventually lose all their wealth, some due to illegal business activities and others to bad investments. One of the primary constants of personal wealth and fortune is that many people don't plan for the long term, while those who envision that future generations use their wealth do think beyond their life.
In the spirit of property creates winners and losers, there are other people out there in kind of the media sphere who would say that everything that person just said is really problematic. And that property, even though it creates wealth for some, it creates a lot of problems for virtually everybody else. It doesn't have access to levels of generational wealth to pass on to their children that maybe the super rich do. And here's a little video kind of making that case, again, just to kind of see both sides of the issue.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal.
Just kidding. Sorry, no. We're not all equal. Inequality, in fact, gets a ton of attention these days. President Obama called it, quote, the defining challenge of our time. But usually when people are talking about inequality, they're talking about income inequality. And income inequality is at its highest level since the Great Depression. Before taxes, the top 1% take home about 22.5% of the national income. Really think about that for a second. For every dollar paid in income in the US, almost a quarter of it goes to the top 1%. A quarter! But income inequality is actually less dangerous than its cousin, wealth inequality. The top 1% hold closer to 40% of the national wealth. So for every dollar in American assets, that's home, stock, savings, all that, 40 cents of it belongs to the top 1%. The top 1% holds more wealth in America than the bottom 90% of the country combined. And a lot of that money gets passed on to their children or their children's children. Take the heirs of Sam Walton, founder of Walmart. None of them founded Walmart. None of them were created equal either. The 6 of them have more than $140 billion in wealth. That makes those 6 people wealthier than the bottom 40% of Americans combined. Now, there's an upside to income inequality. That income is a reward for people who start great businesses and do great things. You can like income inequality, you can hate it, but at least it is money they earned in this lifetime, usually through talent or risk or hard work with a little bit of luck. But wealth inequality isn't like that. That money is often a reward for people who are just born into the right family, and it's money that keeps growing. That's a big point economist Thomas Piketty makes in his new book, Capital. The rate of the return on capital or wealth is higher than the growth rate of the overall economy. So people who have a lot of wealth, they tend to get wealthier and wealthier and wealthier unless something like a war or a tax intervenes. One way they get wealthier, by the way, is politics. A lot of money can buy you a lot of political speech, particularly now that the Supreme Court is systematically dismantling the limits on buying political speech. This is a doom loop of oligarchy. Wealth buys power, power buys more wealth means more power means more wealth, and on and on and on we go until a very small fraction of the population has a whole lot of the power and a whole lot of the money. So no, all men and women aren't born equal. Some are born really, really wealthy.
So when we put those two videos in conversation, I think what they tell us is that, again, property creates winners and losers. And that's the theme for the second half of the class. And I think we're going to see that very clearly illustrated in this next section, which I'm calling American Homeownership, Promises and Perils. So let's just start by making a few observations about homeownership. Although today, most Americans do own their homes, that was not always the case. And in fact, about 100 years ago, 120-ish years ago, in the early 20th century, generally speaking, folks in upper middle or above income brackets owned homes. However, homeownership was the exception and not the rule, and here is some data to reflect that. So here we see in the late 1800s, early 1900s, less than half of Americans owned their own homes, and that went even lower during the Great Depression, right? However, since then, even though there's been some ups and downs, in the past few decades, the general trend and trajectory has been more and more and more and more Americans owning their own homes, and we hit a high point in the early 2000s when nearly 70% of Americans own their own homes. Now, you might be wondering, why was there such a dramatic increase here? Well, part of that was the 1950s and the baby boom and the post-war boom and all that stuff that we looked at a little while ago. Again, is why some people would say we're still living in the boomers' world in terms of attitudes and norms towards homeownership. So again, to reiterate that, between the 30s and the 50s, the US government introduces a swath of popular programs to subsidize mortgages and help with loans. Homeownership skyrockets, and by the 1960s, owning a suburban home had moved to the center of the American dream. So the concept of the American dream had been around for a while. Homeownership was not always kind of at the center of that, but by the time we get to the 1960s and 70s, that had changed. More and more Americans were owning their homes. The government had introduced a bunch of programs during the Great Depression and after the World War II to really encourage homeownership. And by the time, Gen Z appears, y'all are arriving in an era in which there were decades and decades and decades of American traditions that value homeownership as kind of the quintessential American identity. And as evidence of this, you can just Google American Dream homeownership or Homeownership America or whatever, and there's all kinds of messaging out there that to be an American today means to aspire to and eventually own your own home. In large part, again, it was the 1950s and 60s that really solidified this norm. So now I want to pivot a little bit and ask the question, well, what about people who can't meet that standard? For a variety of economic reasons, just even the idea of owning a home is just completely out of reach for them. In order to kind of ask that question, I want to get a little philosophical, right? Because if you look at most of human history, the idea of owning your own physical real estate that was yours, to do what you want with, That is actually an aberration. That is not the historical norm if you look at most of human history. So another way to say that is that the idea of like housing insecurity, of not being able to afford to live somewhere, is a modern invention. You know, for most of human history, human beings were tribal and had tribal lands that were not owned by individuals, and the idea of not having a place to live was completely ridiculous. Medieval Europe, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying we should go back to medieval Europe. I don't think the feudal system was great. However, one of the kind of weird benefits of the feudal system was that homelessness wasn't a thing, right? If the royals or the Catholic Church or whoever, these big institutions, kind of own all the land and there were common usage rights, well, the idea of like not having a place to live just was not a thought, right? It was not an issue. And in a lot of ways, kind of the modern capitalist system of private property has kind of indirectly created some of these problems that we're still dealing with today. Start exploring that via this question. What happens when you tie a basic human need to economic markets, right? So again, food, water, shelter, basic human needs. For most of human history, shelter was not something people had to struggle to find, right? A place to live, a home, was not tied to your ability to generate income to be able to afford that, right? This has been a huge shift over the past 200 years. So what have been some of the unintended consequences of that? Well, one of them is cost-burdened renting. About half of renters in the United States are cost-burdened, which means they pay 30% or more of their income on rent, making it statistically difficult, if not impossible, to build equity. Video kind of introducing you to some of the people who are burdened. Here's a little video introducing you to some of the people who are living in this situation.
Rental prices are unaffordable for a record number of Americans, with half of all renters paying more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities. That's according to a new report from Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies that examined 2022 census data. We reached out to renters across the country to hear how these soaring prices are impacting their lives.
My name's Kathleen Hahn, and I am almost 46 years old. I live outside of Atlanta, Georgia. I am probably paying about 2/3 of my income, my monthly income in rent.
My name is Dwayne Precise. I am 62 years old, and I live in Tucson, Arizona. My rent is about 75% of my income.
So my name is Tasha Ford. I live in Caldwell, Idaho. I am 35, almost 36. For percentage of my income on rent, I spend about roughly 42% between rent and utilities.
My name is Jade Galecki. I'm 26 years old in Charleston, South Carolina. I estimate that I spend about 60% of my monthly income on rent and utilities.
My name is Dennis Layden. I'm 34 and I live in Panama City, Florida. Your rent is, taking up a third or more of your budget. The first thing that you have to get rid of is your entertainment budget. You have to get rid of things that give us, I guess, relief.
In 1 year, I had a $300 price hike. And then just this last year, it was a $700 price hike. If it keeps going up, we're going to have to reevaluate a lot of things. We're going to have to reevaluate family members being to have their own space.
The only option that'd be cheaper really is a trailer. You can get a double wide trailer for between $600 and $700, which is still more than half of my income, but it's less than 75%.
In order to make up for the additional cost of rent, we do have to every once in a while go to, food pantries to even subsidize our grocery budget, which is abysmal at this point.
At the end of the day, when you're paying that much, you really can only afford food, your utilities, your living, your rent, and then obviously gas and stuff like that. And, that's it.
I can't see myself going without having roommates. In my current situation, I actually live with a couple who's no longer a couple anymore, but we cannot afford to live elsewhere. So we have 3 people in a 2-bedroom, 2 of whom are no longer in a relationship and sharing a room because of how hard it is to find housing.
It's nerve-wracking. There's no real way to prepare for it, especially if you're going to be low. And there are times when I have to think about, in the next couple of days, do I need food for me or for the pets more?
There are times when money is so tight that we'll all go out as a family and do DoorDash together. So, it's embarrassing. It's not fun, especially, since I have a professional job and things like that. And, I have an MBA and I'm out delivering DoorDash on the side. And so my kids, they're aware of the financial pressures, but at the same time, it's like we take those opportunities to spend time together as a family.
I think I'm going to be running my whole entire life. And that's, it's really sad because I make a good living. I'm a middle of the road American and I should be able to buy a house.
It is a constant hamster wheel of working just to go to sleep at night somewhere. And it's hard.
Now, cost burden renting has gotten worse in the past few years. So this is the most recent data I could find. This is from 2019 to 2020. There was a 1.9 million cost burden renter household increase from 2019 to 2020. I don't have recent data, but whether this has gone up or down a little bit, it's still not a very encouraging trend. And here's a chart kind of breaking this problem down by metropolitan area. What we're seeing is if you're on this side of the line, you are living in a metropolitan area in which in general, the rent is increasing faster than incomes, whereas if you're living below the line, it's the opposite. So basically, let's all move to Augusta, Georgia. This would be a good time to pull up some data from your survey. One of the questions I asked you was below is a list of different types of dwelling places and living arrangements. Please check each item that applies to you at some point in your life. Finish the sentence, I have lived in blank. So it looks like most of us grew up in the suburbs. About more than half of us have lived in a city before. This is actually higher than the typical when I teach the UMBC students. About a third of us have lived in a rural area. Most of us have rented, but the vast majority of us, right, have lived in a place owned by a parent or guardian, right? So again, home ownership is something that most of us have experienced indirectly. And as we get down, we get to some more kind of complicated living arrangements. Mobile home, public housing or place paid for by a housing voucher, a single family detached house, right? So most of us have lived in a house with a yard, ostensibly, an apartment or condo, a state of temporary brief homelessness, 3 of you. Wow. Again, this is higher than I usually get from my UMBC students. And I thank you for sharing this data because that's something that, a lot of people might not feel comfortable talking about. Now, one person, state of prolonged homelessness. So, we're going to be talking about this issue soon. So this is obviously an issue that some of you have dealt with. So whether you have or not, though, I think this will be an interesting and fruitful discussion. Another unintended consequence of having a place to live to an economic market is just concentrated poverty. Millions of Americans live in dilapidated neighborhoods and or public housing complexes where most or all of their neighbors are also poor and unable to build equity, right? So Americans vote with their feet. Generally speaking, in America, one of our norms is that, we live in the nicest places that we can afford. And most of Americans, whether you're, liberal, conservative, black, white, Asian, whatever, most Americans just do that. And I think that includes immigrant populations, right? This is a core American norm. However, one of the unintended consequences of everybody wanting to live in the nicest places they can is that there are these huge pockets all over America, particularly in urban areas and rural areas, in which, for the most part, the only people living there are people who can't afford to leave. And, as someone who lives in Baltimore and who loves Baltimore, you see this all over the place. There are certain neighborhoods in Baltimore, which, 80 years ago were majority white, were majority middle class, or even upper working class. And today, they are huge centers of abandonment and disinvestment. And the people who still live in these communities, and yes, there are people who still live in these communities, probably don't have the kinds of jobs that will allow them to move out someday.
According to the United Way, 53% of Baltimoreans can't afford the city's high cost of living. Even those above the poverty line struggle to pay their bills. WMER2 News' Jeff Morgan sat down with someone the United Way classifies as an Alice family to see what struggles it brings.
Asset limited, income constrained, employed, or ALICE. It's the United Way's classification for people above the federal poverty line but struggling to afford their needs. In Baltimore City, a single person making less than $17 an hour qualifies. That's the bracket Jess Russell falls in.
we are a working class, right? However, we do not necessarily qualify for any type of assistance, whether it's SNAP program, WIC, whatever the case may be, even energy assistance.
Russell works at the library and lives in Baltimore City. Her toughest time was during the pandemic when the school system she used to work for cut her position.
I was several months behind in my rent, my bills, and I was facing huge hardships, as well as eviction. And so United Way actually did provide me assistance with my rent. They covered, I think it was like 8 months of my rent that I was backed up on, and then also paid 3 months in the future.
Russell took the assistance from the United Way, got a new job, and hasn't had to use it since. Still, unexpected expenses can be a major burden.
There's no savings necessarily to pull from. It more so is foregoing one bill or one expense to deal with an unexpected occurrence.
The United Way estimates 38% of Maryland families are below the ALICE threshold, which varies based on how many adults or children are in a household. For people in need of assistance, the United Way helps them with costs like housing, medical bills, transportation needs, and funeral expenses. Mainly, the organization connects people to other programs that provide the assistance.
Whatever we can do to ease the burden for healthcare, for food, housing, etc. That's really what we try to do through our interventions, through our program, through our partnership with other nonprofits, and then trying to work with the legislators to change policy.
Unfortunately, due to rising costs and the pandemic, the number of ALICE families and those under federal poverty line is growing in Maryland.
Of course, unfortunately, in America, poverty concentration and racial segregation kind of go together. So what we see here is that Black and Hispanic Americans have much higher poverty rates than other groups, right? And again, these poverty rates tend to concentrate in particular areas of the country in which almost nobody with, equity and income and kind of middle class, striving values, those people tend to leave. And it makes those concentrations of very poor, typically very Black and brown people even higher. And let me just further illustrate this on a local level with some maps. Okay, so this is a map. It's a few years old, but things haven't changed much since, showing the concentrations of Black people in Baltimore City, right? So in other words, the darker blue we are, the more Black people live there. And, since in America, race and class, race and poverty have lived together. Oftentimes when you have majority Black and brown areas in the city, you have areas in which poverty tends to concentrate, right? So this is kind of showing color-wise as opposite. So the lighter we get, the more poor you are, basically. And as you can see, virtually all of the very poor areas map almost exactly onto the majority Black areas, and the majority wealthy areas map perfectly onto the white areas. And here's just another map showing unemployment, right? Virtually every time you have a dark red area with very high unemployment, you look over here, well, those are also majority Black areas. And again, there's a lot of reasons why this is, but the primary reasons is because of our American norms of owning a home in the best possible place that you can and leaving the places behind that in some cases your families lived for a generation or two for greener pastures, typically in the suburbs. By the way, the issue of the tension between the city and the suburbs is something I really care about, and I'm going to do a whole lecture on it next week. So if you're feeling like this is a really interesting issue and you feel like I'm not dealing with it sufficiently here, we're going to jump back to it more in depth later on. Okay, the third unintended consequence of tying having a place to live to an economic market is homelessness. Homelessness is a modern invention. Homelessness was invented by capitalism, for better or for worse. Homelessness is a direct result of tying access to housing to markets, right? The US currently has around 600,000 unhoused folks. And here's some data to demonstrate that. So, over the past, decade or more, the homeless rates have gone up and down, but they have not really changed dramatically. They tend to hover right around 600,000, either slightly above or slightly below. However, I will say these numbers are definitely not correct. It is basically impossible to count the number of unhoused people, right, in America, particularly since a significant portion of unhoused people are, living with other people, living in people's basements, friends' basements, living on people's couches. And those people tend not to get counted in this number. Now, this is an issue that we've all probably indirectly dealt with, right? Pretty much all of us have the experience of, going to, a sports stadium or a museum or the aquarium or, touristy destination in a downtown area and having that very uncomfortable experience of being stuck at a red light and having someone right at your window with a sign asking for money or food, right? And unfortunately, in America, we tend to view unhoused people as an annoyance, as an irritant, right? That's why I don't go to the city. Actually, fun little personal story. My wife and I went to a comedy, like a local comedy show a few nights ago, and it was all like Baltimore-based comedians. You know, there was like 20 people in the room. It was really small. And one of the comedians had this really funny joke about how one of his hobbies is he loves sitting at one of the major intersections of downtown Baltimore, where like Highway 83 kind of dumps out into the downtown area. And, you know, he just enjoys like sitting there and watching white suburbanites like freak out and roll their windows up every time they pull up to an intersection and a homeless person tries to talk to them. Obviously, that's just a joke, a comedian said, but I think there's some truth to that. Right? Virtually all of us have had some kind of interaction with someone who didn't have a place to live. I think many of us, and me sometimes even. So just to be honest here, our response generally is kind of revulsion and like, ooh, get away from me. I don't want to talk to you. That's a shame because these are human beings just like the rest of us. And here's a little video, I think, to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about.
This is the sound of someone's entire life essentially being thrown in the trash. In the middle of recent record-breaking rain in Los Angeles, the city is today clearing an encampment for unhoused people. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass campaigned on fixing the city's homeless crisis. This is, theoretically, part of that fix.
This is exactly why I ran for mayor. This is the reason why.
Mayor Bass took me to see the cleanup firsthand, getting people out of tents and onto buses and into temporary housing. They leave behind anything they cannot carry.
I was recently stabbed about 2 weeks ago. This is like a godsend right now, like getting indoors and being away from this.
Inside Safe is the name of Mayor Bass's flagship program to tear down these encampments and bring LA's unhoused indoors.
So when I spoke to you about a year ago, you talked about your goal for homelessness and the end of homelessness in Los Angeles by the end of your first term.
Well, I think the progress is going well. We destroyed the myth that people do not want to leave the tents. People don't want to leave the cars and their RVs. We've had the opposite problem. We have more people willing to leave than we have rooms for.
In a remarkable new study, researchers at the University of California, San Francisco surveyed thousands of the homeless in California. Nearly 90% of participants said high housing costs were a barrier to their moving into permanent housing. And the majority of those surveyed did want to get off the streets.
There are people on the street that don't want to be housed, but most of them do, you know? It's just finding the right housing for them in the right situation.
Major factors to finding housing are high rents and low income. Then, of course, there's also discrimination and bad credit. Some people don't even have ID. Some have been evicted before. Many are dealing with addiction or struggling with physical or mental health problems.
Now, to finish out our exploration on how America's homeownership norms creates winners and losers, I want to hear from the losers a little bit more. I mean, losers metaphorically. I mean, they're actual losers. When I structure this class, whatever issue we're dealing with, I always want to hear from Americans who are on the kind of losing side of the issue. Now, why is that? Well, a number of reasons. Firstly, because that's what we do in American studies. We say, okay, there's these things that America says about itself. It has a lot of self-views, right? This is what we are. This is what we're about. And one way to test whether those self-views are accurate is to listen to the people who are kind of on the negative receiving end of that. As someone who grew up middle class and really benefiting from a lot of these systems that America has set up, it was a really, really important experience for me as I got older, as I started working in places like failing public schools and prisons and places like that, to hear the stories of people who have not had the same experience as I am, right? So in other words, I want to understand what American identity is from the margins. And, just to let you know, that's part of the reason why I focus on some of the things about America that doesn't work so much. Additionally, I have a good friend who's had personal experience with this issue. So let me introduce you to someone. This is my friend Tariq, AKA Infinity Knives. He's a musician. That's his musician name. So Tariq Infinity Knives Ravelo Manana is a local artist. He does a mixture of contemporary classical and hip hop, which is really, really interesting. And a few years ago, he put an album out with a local MC called King Cobra. And it was a really respected kind of indie hip hop album. So much so that Spin, which is like a kind of indie and rock music website, named their album one of the best albums of 2022. And the reason I'm bringing this album up is because Tariq himself was homeless for a year. Basically, he's an immigrant kid. His mom is from Tanzania, and he had a lot of immigrant kid issues, which turned into him acting out and running away from home. And one day when he came home his mom had moved out and didn't tell her where she had went. And for his entire senior year of high school, which he eventually dropped out of high school, he lived on the streets of Baltimore for a year. And it was a very harrowing and horrendous and life-changing experience, but one that really shaped him, so much so that he wrote a whole song about it, one of the songs off of their album, King Cobra. And again, why am I talking about this? Well, because I want us to hear from people who have experienced living on the streets, because that is an experience that most of us will never encounter. And I think it's really instructive, and I would say even humbling for us to hear from these people. So I'm going to play a song from the album. It's a hip hop song. It's pretty offensive. There's some violence in it and cursing and whatnot. But I think it's worth being exposed to some potentially offensive material if it means hearing from someone who's had an experience that most of us could never imagine. All right, check it out.
I'ma kill my landlord, so I got a heater. Specifically, a nigga got a 9mm. If he don't believe in God, I'ma make him a believer. He will have no choice, cause he really about to need it. So yo, 6 weeks ago, I'm getting evicted. Beg my landlord to help a nigga. Said he couldn't risk it in the streets. Been out here for weeks, shitting where I sleep. Ain't got shit to eat. Bro, this homeless shit is beat. Rewind, 2 months ago, I lost my job. Was living check to check, but check to check is getting robbed. Home of the free, land of the underpaid. Basically, had a closet off a minimum wage. Now I don't even have that, but I know where he's at. I'm shooting him, probably his family, and maybe the cat. Last year, shorty, she left the state with my son. This is America, so I spent my last on a gun. Yo, shout out to sex workers. Trans lives matter, house the unhoused, black power. I don't give a fuck who just became a billionaire. I don't give a fuck if they black. You better off telling me who just dropped the deuce or who's in the stepsister porn. I don't give a fuck, nigga. So there's this dude, and his name is Jim. He just trying to live. Alcoholic, schizophrenic, said he lost his wife and kid. He's in pain, so like Kurt Cobain, he lives under a bridge. Told Jim they threw my shit out, even the food in the fridge. My TV was right next to a mayonnaise lid. Jim wants to kill my landlord too. He's so thin, I see his ribs. See, Jim was in the army, so he used to be a slave. Black leather jacket year round, niggas call him plain. So we gon' make it do what it do. Now keep in mind what he says, I don't know how much is true. Special forces, he saw too many corpses, different origins. Sometimes he's from DC, and sometimes he's from New Orleans. So he's bout it, I don't doubt it. Even with the voices in his head that keep his mind crowded. Don't know what he's seen, I just know my nigga's scarred. And I see myself in him when I hear him question God. No more GoFundMe's for your whack-ass album. Sell some ass and kick a door in. Male modeling is not a real profession. That's what Zoolander was about. Everybody sucks. So 1 week later, we ready. I finally got the nerve. No money for a bus. Me and Jim walk to the birds. I'm fucking tired. Hit the house, break the lock. Jim Wyatt, landlord looking at us. Jim starts shooting fire. Landlord's running for the stairs like homeless me. He's scared, but I had no idea that his kids would really be there. I don't want no parts. I'm thinking run out the door. His daughter's preschool age can't be more than like 4. I'm panicking, stiff as a mannequin. Jim's going commando. He think he in Iraq again. They running, Jim shooting. I'm screaming, yo, stay calm. Next thing you know, the cops is here. We must have tripped an alarm. Jim aimed and lick a shot. I'm trying to shield up the top. The pick started shooting reckless, cause cops is gonna be cops. I'm hit, losing consciousness. Jim's still alive, but the landlord's dead, cause cops is fucking incompetent. Fuck niggas that pose next to cars.
So to recap, America's culture of homeownership in the US creates winners and losers, right? Winners for those who can afford it and build equity and pass it on to their children, and losers, including people who face cost burden renting, concentrated poverty, and homelessness. For our next and final case study, we're going to look at intellectual property, public domain, and the common interest. And I just want to start just by defining intellectual property. So, or IP for short. So what is IP today? IP concepts have changed drastically since the founding. So today, IP includes four general categories. Category one being patents. Patents are temporary monopolies of an idea and or invention. So some examples include a machine part or a piece of software. So for example, Thomas Edison, when he patented the light bulb in 1890, you basically you submit a diagram, you describe each of the parts, and the patent is kind of for each of those parts individually, right? So people can't use those individual parts or the whole thing without your permission. And that's the same case today. This is a great example. This is an older version of the iPhone, but basically today companies, then as now, companies try to patent everything, right? So in other words, if you want to put your own cell phone out and your camera was in the exact same place in the exact same shape, well, Apple might be able to sue you for patent infringement. The second category are copyrights. These are rights over creative works of original authorship. So for example, a song or a movie script. And there are obviously endless examples of this. So this is SZA's latest album. So both the album art itself and each individual song and each music video and each photograph on the inside and outside of the album art, right? Those are all copyright, Minecraft, video games, video game characters, all kinds of things, right? Anything that you create, you can copyright pretty much. Trademarks. Those are brand names, logos, and slogans. So the Nike swoosh, for example, I'm loving it, the McDonald's slogan, right? If you opened a burger place and made I'm loving it your slogan, McDonald's would obliterate you from the planet because that is trademark infringement. And obviously, trademarks are all over the place and a big part of the IP world. And then finally, trade secrets. Trade secrets are information you don't want competitors to have and therefore you don't need to share. Business plans, secret food ingredients. I think food ingredients is the best example of trade secrets. For example, Old Bay, which basically is the only seasoning that anyone should ever need for any kind of food. If you look at the ingredients on the back, you will see things you recognize, celery salt, etc. And then spices, including red pepper and black pepper, right? So there are other spices in there. And according to our laws, you have to tell people what's in their food, but there's kind of a middle ground, like a gray area, where if there are certain things in your food that you feel like revealing them to your customers would be giving away your trade secrets, you can kind of shield yourself behind those things, right? Our current kind of rules and laws around intellectual property have an immediate antecedent in the founding era. So in 1710, when the United States was not the United States, we were just British colonies, the British Parliament passed something called the Statute of Anne. So a statute is just like a law or legal doctrine. It was the first British IP law. It granted authors a 14-year period of exclusive rights to their books. So before this, being an author made almost no money. The people who make money was the publishers who made your books. And some authors were mad about this, and they passed the first significant piece of British intellectual property law, which again would underpin a lot of American intellectual property laws later. Here's what Statute of Anne looked like. I can't read this. And here's an example. Some of you might have heard of this guy, Jonathan Swift, author of Gulliver's Travels. This is an example of kind of an early published work that was copyrighted. And the founders cared so much about this issue that they included it in the Constitution. So in the Constitution, the founders granted Congress the power to regulate IP. So I'm going to show you a chunk of that text in a second. The purpose, however, of intellectual property is spelled out to promote the progress of science and useful arts. So here are some examples of that. So there's two clauses about intellectual property. They both appear under the larger article that spells out the powers of Congress and says the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. So you're like, why? This has nothing to do with copyrights. Well, I guess I'm just saying, like, the next thing I'm going to show you is under this larger section of like Congress being able to do things in terms of kind of national taxation and things like that. To promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. Right? That's not a complete sentence. Yes, I know it's not a complete sentence, but again, it's kind of like a bullet point under this larger statement. So long story short, the Constitution basically says, again, the Constitution is a framework. It's not a law, right? Necessarily, at least in terms of like being specific. So basically, Congress eventually did pass a series of intellectual property laws. But again, the founders thought this was so important that they specifically said, okay, this is one of Congress's jobs. And the earliest IP laws were intended to balance the rights of creators with the general welfare of society. And you're like, okay, what does that have to do with anything? Well, just bear with me. To kind of skip ahead a little bit and to reference one of the talkback videos you watched, a lot of people feel today like our intellectual property laws are way out of whack and really, really, really highly favor people who hold the patents and the copyrights and disfavor people who do not. Again, winners and losers. But initially, that was not the purpose. The purpose was to try to strike a balance. So here's a little graph kind of showing that little seesaw thing. On one hand, the earliest intellectual property laws passed by Congress in the late 1700s granted exclusive rights of creators over their property, which created a natural economic incentive to create and invent. So there's two things here. One is it's kind of again, this is kind of Enlightenment philosophy, right? Kind of Enlightenment philosophy in this like burgeoning capitalist economy is like, well, in a capitalist economy, you need to incentivize people to want to create things, right? If I can't get paid for something I make, why would I make it, right? And then the other side of this is, we're a young country. We want people to invent. We want people to create things. So the earliest intellectual property laws kind of protected that financial incentive so that creativity could flourish, right? But on the other hand, all early laws by Congress put limits on intellectual property, right? You couldn't own it forever. Depending on which law, which era we're talking about, it was maybe 5 years or 10 years or 15 years or whatever. But this is the important point. The time-limited nature of IP licenses ensured that innovations would ultimately be in the public domain, thus promoting the general welfare. So the ultimate purpose of intellectual property law was not for a very small number of people to make a ton of money. It was to, as this says up here, promote the progress of science and useful arts, right? America was this experiment in democracy and had a very kind of like can-do, like DIY kind of spirit. And Congress wanted to encourage that through its laws. So early intellectual property laws were time limited, right? Because ultimately the purpose was people invent cool stuff and eventually it belongs to everybody, right? That was the main goal, to make science and knowledge and arts flourish. However, today, many creators, entrepreneurs, and legal experts assert that the balance between economic incentives and the public domain has shifted away from the general public welfare towards IP holders. So public domain means stuff that you can use for free. So again, Steamboat Willie and the earliest iterations of Winnie the Pooh are public domain, right? They being the people who are critics of this, view this as a violation of the foundational ideas behind IP laws for the benefit of one side. So again, a lot of people from across the political spectrum feel like the state of intellectual property is not healthy and benefits the people who hold intellectual property and disadvantages people who don't, and basically keeps things locked out of the public domain for decades and decades and decades and decades and decades. And I think your talkback video did a really good job of exploring some of the ways that this happens, and particularly, giving you hopefully some more insight into why I despise Mickey Mouse and Disney so much. There are a lot of reasons, but this video, I think, laid out some of the reasons why. Building off the video, let me just lay out a few concepts to, again, kind of like put things on the table and say, okay, here is why some people think that IP is out of whack. So Americans' IP traditions do include something known as fair use. So fair use is a legal doctrine in which intellectual property can be used without permission, including parody, commentary, reporting, and scholarship. Parody is a great example. Think of sketch comedy shows like Key and Peele and Saturday Night Live, right? They can do parodies of famous movies and other pieces of intellectual property. Why? Well, because a long time ago, there was a Supreme Court case that basically said parody is fair use. Commentary, right? So if somebody makes a documentary and they're commenting on something, there are certain instances in which they can use copyrighted material to further their argument. Reporting is obvious, and scholarship, right? When an academic writes a paper, they don't have to get permission to cite someone else's paper or journal or whatever. They just put a footnote. However, fair use is an ambiguous concept that is constantly being challenged by the following. So I want to get more into the issues now. One of the big issues today is lawsuits. People who hold intellectual property often use the threat of lawsuits to stop both illegal and fair use of their property. Most content creators back down at the threat. Let me give you an example. In some of the other classes I teach, I curate YouTube playlists. So if I play stuff in class, students can go and check those outside of class. Sometimes I'll take little like 2 or 3 minute snippets from documentaries. According to fair use, as an educator, I'm allowed to do that, right? And again, they're kind of like vague but specific. So it's like you can only use like so much percentage of a larger work, but if you're borrowing from another work as an academic, using it to further an argument, that is fair use. However, YouTube doesn't recognize that. So if I take a 2-minute snippet from a documentary that's like 2 hours long or an hour and a half long or whatever, which is fair use, and I post it, I will immediately get a copyright strike and get some email saying this has been taken down and you can't post this again. Now, I could hire a lawyer and fight it, but I don't have the money or the time to do that. So this is why most people, when even threatened with a lawsuit, even if they could probably beat it if they went to court, most people back down. Kind of related to this is patent trolls. So like, if you know what patent trolls are, I'm just explaining, I'll play a little video that'll explain it better. Patent trolls are people who buy up or create patents for no purpose other than to bring frivolous lawsuits against violators and or bleed honest patent users for money. Here's a little video explaining that.
So patents are all about the money. Let's talk about that in the thought bubble. In terms of economic impact, patent law is arguably the most important branch of intellectual property. There are legitimate questions about the role of patents and what types of research and development patent law encourages. Does the law encourage more research into highly lucrative erectile dysfunction medication than stuff like anti-malarial drugs? Should developing nations be able to create public health exceptions for life-saving proprietary medications? If so, then how would companies be able to pay for the development of these medications or future life-saving medications without the assurance of patent protection? And then there are non-practicing entities, often called patent trolls, that go around acquiring huge patent portfolios and then threaten to sue pretty much everybody. Patent trolls bring these lawsuits despite the fact that they have no interest in developing or manufacturing any actual products. This is their business model. Because of the high cost of litigation, costs can range from about $1 million to $5 million if this goes to trial, and the threat of massive damage awards, most companies sued by patent trolls settle or agree to pay licensing fees to the trolls. There's legislation pending in Congress designed to address this issue.
The last part, and again, this comes back to Disney again, is corporate lobbying. So Disney in particular, I mean, other corporations are guilty of this, but Disney is the worst offender by far, routinely lobby Congress to change the patent laws so that they can continue to make money off of IP that would and should have been in the public domain decades ago. Again, the original version of Mickey Mouse, I think, was supposed to go in the public domain in like the 1970s, like before I was born. But every few years when this is about to happen, various corporations get together and get their high-powered lawyers to lobby Congress to change it. And, you know, depending on, again, what kind of patent you have or trademark or whatever, there are some instances in which, you know, if you create something, the copyright holder can hold that until the entire life of the author, like what life of the creator, plus like 30 or 40 or 50 or 70 years, right? Which is, again, is how Mickey Mouse stayed in public domain for so long, because corporate lobbying has been very effective in manipulating laws so that they benefit the IP holders and kind of take away from the public domain. And that brings us to the end. So again, we began with just a brief overview of property, and I made the argument that American property traditions create winners and create losers. And then we looked at 2 case studies. One was the culture of American homeownership, and the second was intellectual property, public domain, and the common interest. I look forward to reading your thoughts, and thanks again.